It's been 2 years since the MiG-23 crash in Michigan with 2 successful ejections. We finally have the NTSB report, the final report with their probable cause analysis and determination, and also some interesting stuff. They released the statements from both pilots involved, and very interesting between the two of them. They landed in the lake.
Wow.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, flight off.
Okay, so this is the investigation final report. Belleville, Michigan, August 13th, 2023 is when this happened. November 23, Uniform Bravo, MiG-23UB destroyed, 2 serious injuries. It was part of the air show. Both the front seat pilot in command and rear seat rated observer, PRO, pilot rated observer, of the Russian manufactured fighter jet reported that the plane's engine did not respond to the application of afterburner during a display pass at an air show. According to the pilot in command, the engine was operating in degraded power condition that was insufficient to sustain altitude and airspeed. Pilot in command maneuvered the airplane back toward the airport while attempting to restore engine power. PIC believed that his corrective measures would have restored power. However, Backseater, the PRO, activated the crew ejection system before engine power was restored. PRO reported that he inquired about ejection with the PIC but did not hear a response before he activated the ejection system. However, PIC reported that he replied no in response to the ejection inquiry and that he was ejected from the airplane while he was still troubleshooting the loss of engine power and flying the aircraft. Although the PIC was completing corrective actions, engine power was not restored by the time of the crew ejection, and therefore the investigation was unable to determine if his corrective efforts would have been successful. According to the PRO, the ejection system was activated about 350 feet above ground level and below 200 knots. Both pilots were ejected from the airplane, and the PRO ejected first, followed by the PIC. The airplane continued to left bank and descended to the ground about 1.7 miles from the runway. The airplane impacted the ground adjacent to an apartment building and was destroyed by impact forces and a fire. Other than the PIC's mechanic, the NTSB is unaware of an independent engine shop or manufacturer within the United States with appropriate tooling and expertise to perform a teardown of the engine. The PIC's written statement, which we're going to talk to about after, addressed potential sources for degraded engine performance. However, NTSB could not validate this opinion or the reason of loss of engine power. Based on photographic evidence, the engine was producing some power at impact. However, the level of power output could not be determined. Due to investigative support limitations and the extent of the damage, investigators were unable to determine the reason for the loss of engine power. The airplane flight manual indicated that during a descent, the minimum safe altitude for crew ejection is calculated based on the rate of descent and is equal to the rate of descent multiplied by 5. Based on 350-foot AGL altitude ejection provided by the Backseater, this altitude would be appropriate for ejection at a maximum rate of descent of 70 feet per minute. Although the airplane's actual rate of descent was not known, it was likely significantly higher than that. Additionally, video evidence showed that the ejection seat parachute did not fully deploy until the occupants had descended to just above treetop level. Therefore, the timing of the crew ejection was not premature. Given the serious injuries received by both occupants, crew ejection at a higher altitude may have reduced the severity of their injuries. Likewise, had the crew ejection been further delayed, the injuries may have been more severe. NTSB determined the probable cause to be a reported partial loss of engine power while maneuvering for reasons that could not be determined. So basically, they don't, you know what? They don't know. Probable causes, we don't know. So they were setting up for a banana pass. They departed runway 23 at Ypsilanti, at first using maximum power, followed by mid-afterburner, then maximum afterburner, and deselected afterburner as he turned the airplane on the downwind leg of the traffic pattern. PIC noted nothing unusual at this time. PIC then maneuvered the airplane for a banana pass, low-level knife-edge display pass, along runway 23. As the airplane approached for the display pass, the PRO, Backseater, swept the wings to 45-degree position, at which time the PIC glanced at his airspeed indicator and noticed the airplane was slower than he thought it should have been, but it was still above the minimum maneuvering speed. PIC believed this may have been the first indication the engine was losing power, but he did not realize it at the time. To increase speed, he advanced the throttle and lowered the nose. About this time, the PRO announced that it was time to engage the afterburner for the display pass. He advanced the throttle to full position and pulled the afterburner paddle switch to engage the afterburner, but there was no increase in engine power. He then announced to the PRO that the afterburner did not engage and he was reattempting. He pulled the throttle back to mid-range and then re-advanced it using the same procedure to engage the afterburner, but there was still no increase in engine power. PIC and PRO confirmed with each other that that an emergency existed. PIC visually located the airport and decided that he needed to continue toward the airport. About this time, the PRO announced that he had selected the wing's 16-degree sweep position, which the PIC acknowledged. He then maneuvered the plane back toward the airport using angle of attack indicator to keep the airplane from entering an aerodynamic stall. He stated that his intention was to place the airplane in an area away from the public at just above stall speed. Remember, I'll explain it in a little bit. His statement goes through a real big explanation about his use of AOA, which we as fighter pilots use a lot more than I think the civilians may use. He located an area that met these criteria and was moving the airplane toward the location. He also noted the engine was running above idle and was still producing some thrust, but not enough to maintain airspeed and altitude. PIC believed that the airplane would have been able to descend to a large field just past a large highway, but short of the runway, which would have been, in my opinion, fatal. Landing a fighter in a field. I mean, it has happened. It's not impossible, but the odds of survival into a field in a jet of any kind they're pretty low, but would have been away from populated areas and buildings. So probably not the most survivable thing, but I think his intent here was to initially point it there and then hope that the engine relights. About this time, the backseater stated that the flap deployment was needed, which the PIC delayed to maintain a better glide ratio. He believed he later selected the takeoff flap position when the airplane was about 190 knots, which was the lowest airspeed he remembered. PIC stated the flight controls were operating during the entire flight and the airplane never approached an aerodynamic stall. PIC stated that once the airplane was established and glide to the selected landing area, he then had time to attempt to diagnose the loss of engine power. So he got him pointed in a direction where he thought the airplane needed to go, and now it's time to figure out the problem, troubleshoot it. He first activated the emergency nozzle control, but did not feel any immediate response from the engine. About that time, the PRO stated, "We need to get out of the jet," to which the PIC responded, "No." PIC stated he was surprised by the backseater statement as he had not considered ejecting and did not thereafter. After attempting to reestablish engine power using the emergency nozzle control, the PIC intended to use the emergency engine control, which bypasses the automatic fuel control. To reestablish engine power, however, he did not remember if he was able to activate the switch before the ejection seat fired and he departed the cockpit because he was in the middle of troubleshooting, and the next thing he knows, he's in a chute. The backseater stated that while the airplane was descending and accelerating for a display pass, he swept the wings back to 45 degrees. As they approached the airshow line, the PIC moved the throttle forward into the afterburner range. The thrust from the engine dropped to near zero, and the airplane began to decelerate. PRO stated that the deceleration was such that he was pulled forward against the shoulder straps. The descent reached 500 feet AGL, and the PIC began a climbing left turn. PIC said they had a problem, and the PRO agreed. PIC moved the throttle to idle, then forward to maximum without afterburner, and then into the afterburner range. PRO stated that there was no change in engine RPM, no restoration of thrust, and no change in engine noise. He then stated that the PIC attempted this throttle movement at least 3 more times. As the airplane climbed, the airspeed decayed, and the PRO stated that he made the airspeed call-outs as the airplane slowed. The PRO told the pilot, "We need the wings to 16 degrees," and PIC agreed. PRO selected 16-degree wing position, and the wings moved to that position, then stated that the airspeed decreased below 200 knots, declared emergency over the airshow communication frequency. PRO said they briefly discussed the engine power loss, and PIC asked if they could make it to runway 27, which the PRO replied, "Nope." He then said that the altitude peaked at 900 feet, and the PIC began trading altitude and maintain airspeed. Airplane was in and out of stall buffet, and he asked the PIC if they needed flaps. He stated the PIC said yes, selected takeoff flaps, and the PRO confirmed the flap and slat deployment. PRO stated the airplane was in a descending left turn with trajectory which would intersect terrain outside the airport perimeter at over 2 miles south of the runway 27. He stated that he communicated the need to eject to the PIC, and after several seconds without response, as the airplane was descending below 300 feet AGL, the PRO activated the ejection sequence. Both occupants were ejected. Video evidence indicated the airplane was in a left bank when the ejection seats fired. The airplane continued in left bank, descending to the ground about 1.7 miles south of the approach into runway 27. 600-foot long wreckage path heading about 3.5 post-explosion impact. next to the apartment building. So the PIC was ATP A320 757 76 777 L39 MiG-23, 21,000 hours, including 42 hours in MiG-23s. That's it. That's not much, I guess, when you're paying for it yourself. In addition to civilian experience, he previously was a naval aviator. He accumulated 2,500 hours flight experience, 47 combat missions, 250 carrier landings. The rear seat, 777, 320, DC-9, CL-65, Saab 340, Embraer 500, 505, Marchetti S-211, and L-39. 15,000 hours, 12 hours in the MiG-23. Lieutenant Colonel in the Air Guard. Reported having 24 hours of military jet flying experience, 50 combat missions. He also reported having formal seat training on the ACs. Wow. On the F-16, T-38, and the T-6. Interesting. So a review of the aircraft and engine logbooks provided by the PIC revealed an engine logbook entry for the installation of a new FCU on a page dated with the year 2018. PIC stated that his mechanic purchased 3 new FCUs on his behalf, one of which was then installed in the airplane. There was a written statement that described events of the day as well as previous loss of engine power in 2018. So I guess that's what facilitated this change of FCU. It is not known whether the term new meant recently manufactured or recently installed, but it was thought to have fixed the anomaly in 2018. It had 13 hours of use between 2018 and the day of the incident. His post-accident statement indicated he believed the engine anomaly was due to an exhaust nozzle assembly actuation system, not the FCU, because he thought the FCU was fixed. Engine fan blades exhibited multiple hard body impacts on leading edges, multiple fan blade tip fractures on the different blades, and the observed damage was consistent with engine rotating under power at the time of impact. There's really no experts, so they couldn't talk to anybody. Survival aspects. The PRO reported that he initiated the ejection when the airplane was about 350 feet and 200 knots. According to the manual, it's a 070 seat. Up to 270 knots, no limitation on height, from 500 to 620, at least 100 feet AGL. With a descent, it's 5 times the descent rate. Obviously, you want to get out before sink rate develops. And there are numerous videos found online. Post-accident review of the videos revealed the ejection seat parachutes did not fully deploy. Test and research, they called another pilot with MiG-23 flight experience. He was a Air Force test pilot and defense contractor, went to test pilot school, had flown with the PIC in the accident airplane, and was on the 2018 flight with the FCU problems. You know, the engine power loss they experienced in 2018 was similar to his knowledge of the accident engine power loss. In the 2018 event, the engine power loss occurred at high altitude, and they chose to perform an air start of the engine. Before the air start, no other emergency procedures were attempted. The engine regained power before landing. After landing, the FCU was found leaking. When asked about the crew ejection during the accident flight, he stated that he'd seen videos of the ejection. He believed the crew was ejected at the last possible moment. He said that in the videos he saw, the flight crew was only under the full parachute canopy for a few seconds before entering the water. He noted, in his opinion, that had this been a military crew ejection, the timing of the ejection would not be in question. He further stated that the biggest reason the ejection seats do not save more lives is due to delayed ejection. He added he doubted the PIC's intent to land the airplane in the field perimeter of the airport would have been survivable. I agree with that. I mean, it's just going off airport in a fighter, man. Not a good plan. But we'll get to it in a second. That was not necessarily his plan. We're going to see what the front seater has to say. NTSB data wasn't useful, and that's the end of that report. So I thought this was interesting. This is the pilot operator accident report and his statement, and you can tell there's no love lost between him and the backseater. A lot of what's in here was already covered. I'm just going to hit the highlights from this. This is all public information that was on the NTSB website docket, but you can tell it was kind of, they weren't friends anymore after this incident. So they had flown 16 flights, 10 hours together prior to the incident. Of those 10, 6.5 were cross-country repositioning flights. 13 of those flights happened most recently on a 5-month period. Crew coordination grew from basically flying solo to the backseater being a valuable crew member, handling most ATC comms and reading normal checklists. So he wasn't just a FAM rider. He was actually considering him a crew member, somebody to help him out. Announce and perform briefed wing movement changes, as well as deploying the aircraft drag chute on landing. He also talked about when and where to light the burner for best effect for spectators during a flyby. Would make the recommended call outs while I do the quote unquote pilot shit. You can tell this is a naval aviator, and safely fly the plane. As in all cases, the PIC, and only MiG-23 rated pilot was guy in the front. He had the right to agree or disagree with any recommendations. So it's just recommendations from the backseat. And he's going to hammer this point home throughout his statement. All but two were in the backseat. Both of his front seat flights were cross country. So he was working towards his type rating on this aircraft and getting checked out, but he just wasn't there yet. There's a lot of like nitnoid stuff in here where he's kind of bringing up the past. And he talks about when switching Mark to the front seat for the first time on a repositioning flight, I was to occupy the rear seat. I noticed the rear seat right shoulder harness was not attached to the ejection seat. I asked Mark about it, and he replied that he remembers it not feeling right, but never bothered to mention it. Also, that the rear AOA gauge didn't work and was NOP at the time that this happened. So the date of the incident, they were talking to a Marine F-35 unit to do the flyover, and it was kind of a big thing. He says he wanted his airspeed closer to 300, and then he realized that was his first indication that things were going poorly when they were slowing 245 knots. Burner didn't light. I'm trying again, pull the throttle back to mid-range, no response from the engine. I don't remember if our wings level completely or for decreased angle of back while diagnosing the engine condition. After comparing with each other that we had an emergency, I then looked over my left shoulder to see where we were in relation to the field. No doubt in my mind that we needed to continue or reestablish our left turn immediately towards the field. Mark said, wings coming to 16. I verbally responded with an affirmative response to the movement. He climbed, but he's not really sure how much he climbed. But for this, he started using the AOA gauge. So he continued slow and started shallow descent, now referencing AOA instead of airspeed from the only functioning AOA gauge, which was in the front cockpit. Remember, his back one was broken. For this emergency situation, the AOA gauge was in an ideal placement, only to come inside the cockpit to the first gauge on the left, just below the glare shield to reference AOA. You cannot stall the airplane if you keep the AOA in the proper range, regardless of the airspeed. As long as I continue to fly and reference this gauge, any airspeed callouts from the observer at this point would be virtually worthless. I mean, yeah, AOA is, that is what you need. Airspeed is a reference. AOA is usually the answer. Now it established the aircraft and desired profile became a 3-variable math problem when you know the aircraft answered, but you have to solve for the variables which are constantly changing. The answer is to put the jet in a designated area, which I was maneuvering to, away from the public at an airspeed just above stalling speed, which was I was not yet at, and at a specific altitude, which I was not yet at as well. This equation is what I've been training to solve so many times before my 40 plus years of flying and over 20,000 flight hours. Especially as an attack pilot in the Navy. He's talking about bombing, meatball lineup AOA as well for the landing on the carrier, which I don't think is, when you're talking single engine, which I've done a lot of, it's different than bombing. Yes, you are putting things into the equation, but we still use airspeed and engine out stuff in the F-16. Yes, AOA is the final determination, but you still have airspeed references. And yeah, sometimes you do have to just do some of that pilot shit. But he's talking about carrier landings. He thought it was not an impossible situation, still flying the airplane, constantly trained for this, whether it's space shuttle, glider, or MiG-23. That's part's true. Engine was running above idle, producing some thrust, which the NTSB has confirmed, but just not enough to maintain altitude and airspeed. I maintained complete control of the aircraft at all times, continuing the turn, changing heading, decreasing altitude and airspeed, but all the time believing we could make it to the field just past a big highway to the north, just short of an actual runway. See, that's not a great plan. But if you're trying to avoid populated areas, I just don't know when he was going to eject, right? Because I don't think riding that out would have been survivable for them. I continued to reference the AOA gauge and continued the intended point of landing in sight. At this point, public safety is number one, and all other concerns are secondary. I heard Mark say we needed flaps. I responded with the delaying comment. I'm not sure of the exact wording, but it's either standby, hold on, or not yet. His statement forced me to take my eyes off my intended point of landing and come back inside to look at the airspeed gauge to analyze the perceived need for flaps. At this point, I saw approximately 210 knots, which is below published minimum maneuvering speed of 215 or 0 flaps. 215 is indeed the book number, which I found displayed on a decal in both cockpits just 3 weeks prior to the incident. I also know that a more accurate representation of the airspeed I needed was being provided by the AOA gauge, which I have been referencing. Now, you talk crew coordination with airline pilots, speed, right? Below XX, flaps, whatever. So, a couple airline guys, they're in that airline mentality. I can easily see, him wanting to call for flaps to not go below the flap speed, just based on habit patterns of flying heavies, because that's a very heavy thing to do. And Viper, the flaps schedule on their own, so a little different. Clean maneuvering airspeed changes based on your actual weight and can vary between flights. It also varies during flights. You burn fuel and become lighter. So I selected to delay the selection of takeoff flaps, half flap position, to achieve a better glide ratio and a clean configuration versus a partially dirty configuration as I continue to reference AOA. I believe I finally selected takeoff flaps at about 190 knots, the slowest airspeed I remember seeing on the airspeed indicator. This was the only flap setting made or discussed. In the manual, there's a published flameout profile for a completely dead engine. The configuration on final would be gear down, flaps up 210 knots to a landing on the runway. Didn't have the luxury of large amounts of altitude or airspeed prior to the event happening. To put the aircraft in this condition still made my intended point of landing. So you can tell things are not going well. I was confident I could land at the site I was looking at in my present gear up, half flap, partial thrust condition. I mean, you're a test pilot at this point because you're going outside of what the manual says you can or should do. Any more flaps would severely add more drag and decrease glide distance, making it more difficult, if not impossible, to make the projected landing site. My present energy state would give me a 50 to 60 knot margin to work with as I get closer to the intended point of landing to either extend my glide even farther if required, or more likely be used to slow my rate of descent prior to reaching ground level. At no point during this flight did the aircraft exceed flying AOA shutter, shake, or approach a stall. He talks about the CRM training from the Navy and the airlines, that they were confirming the emergency, silence the warning. They were performing as a crew. So he talks about they were as a crew. Next step, aviate, navigate, and communicate. He was doing that. He was doing the aviate and navigating, and he admits that the communication probably wasn't great between the two of them. Mark was not aviating because that wasn't his responsibility. He's also severely limited in helping with navigational duties. And we talked about this. Outside visibility and sitting position in the rear cockpit is one of the worst in the aviation industry. I've talked about that before. He did also have a small GPS, but it was probably not very helpful in this situation. Did not have the rear periscope available because the gear remained up, and that helps him see over the front. So he didn't have any real forward visibility. He's just looking out basically the sides. His hands were free to reference the emergency pocket checklist, but he chose not to do so. His communication with me inside the cockpit was more of a hindrance than providing any useful information, but he did declare an emergency with the air boss. The PIC's attention was looking outside to the left, the intended point of landing, and left-hand turn, looking inside, troubleshooting on the left sidewall panel. So everything he's doing is looking over here. Since all engine performance gauges and annunciator indicators are located below the glare shield level and on the right side of the cockpit, it might have been helpful if my backseater would have provided me with engine information or to communicate with me, and non-normal annunciator lights were illuminated. Again, he chose not to do so in silence. So again, no love lost here. At this point in time, believing the navigation problem was under control and far from being task saturated, I attempted to better my thrust situation for an even more desirable outcome. Initial thought was that possibly the jet exhaust nozzles may have malfunctioned and were not in proper position, resulting in a severe decrease in thrust. I located this left side panel just above the throttle where there's bank guarded switches for various malfunctions. I moved the red guard switch from emergency nozzle control, moved the silver toggle switch to the up emergency position. I did not feel any immediate difference in performance. It takes 3 to 5 seconds for this to take effect. I then located the white guarded switch next to the emergency nozzle control switch. This switch is labeled emergency engine control. My plan was to activate the switch to bypass the automatic fuel control to establish manual fuel control method. There's the switches. That's what they all look like. God, that's a tough cockpit, man. So he said, if there had been a CVR, this is his virtual CVR. This is what he thinks it would have said. PIC, burner didn't light. I'm trying again. Wings coming to 16, says the observer. PIC, an affirmative response such as good call or roger, and then you need to climb from the backseater. MiG has an emergency to the air boss from the observer. We need flaps, stand by, hold on, or not yet. We need to get out of the jet, to which he responded, no. The only words spoken from my safety pilot after his recommendation of flaps were, we need to get out of the jet. I immediately responded with no. He says very forcefully. I remember being surprised at a statement, we need to get out. I hadn't even thought about that up until this point, nor did I consider it again. Well, I mean, yes, you're trying to save this thing, but it should be a consideration. My right hand was on the control stick. My left hand was in the vicinity of the throttles and left shoulder panel console area. My head was lifted forward and to the left. Oh boy, this is sounding painful. Looking at the next switch to be moved, I was then, without any notice, violently ejected from the PIC flying position. Public safety was still my number one priority, But as soon as the backseater activated his ejection handle without notice, he put his own safety ahead of the public and me. Again, no love lost here. I don't remember if I had the opportunity to open the guarded switch and move the toggle switch to emergency engine control, or move the guard of the switch, as I was only able to visually acquire the switch and put my hand on it before being violently ejected from the flying jet. I know my arm was in position of moving the switch because I suffered a large hematoma on my left arm from where the arm guard to the ejection seat came down rapidly during the ejection process to prevent flail injuries once hitting the airstream. I do remember how violent and explosive the event was. I remember my right hand being yanked from the control stick and me still grasping for it as I was engulfed in a ball of fire, rocketed from the cockpit, thinking if only I could grab the control stick, I could still somehow do something. My initial thought was that the airplane was exploding around me and that I had not that I had been ejected. Why would I have the thought I was ejected? The last clear, concise single word in the cockpit was a no. There was no command to eject, as I would have certainly at least leveled the wings, raised the nose, and airspeed, and maybe had enough time to prepare my body physically to have been exploded out of the cockpit. These procedures are not something highly trained strike pilot has to think of. They'd be instinctual and automatic if commanded by another or initiated. Remember some of the wording. This is because he's writing to the NTSB, so there's a lot of hyperbole on this. I would have put my body in a position to better survive the ejection, not with my head down, looking forward to the left, flipping switches. It wasn't until feeling the tug of the parachute deployment that I realized the seat did fire, either accidentally after an explosion or that Mark had purposely ejected us. So they did the chute ride down and they met up on the dock and they were not happy with each other. And once they got to the ambulance, Mark then turned towards me and said, "Well, Dan, we have one hell of a story to tell. We just got to figure out how to tell it." It was at this point my feelings of betrayal and disgust towards Mark grew even more. It appeared to me he was already trying to put a positive spin on the tragic event, which he took total control of once he pulled the ejection handle. Long, uncomfortable, quiet ambulance ride to the hospital. All the time I kept thinking to myself, I can't believe he just ejected us from a jet while I was trying to fly it. We still didn't know if there was any injuries or fatalities as a result. And now he was concerned about how he's going to tell his story. And he talks about how when they first talked, he seemed surprised to learn that I was still troubleshooting the problem, flying the jet, not in a position to eject. And more importantly, that he had ejected both of us when he pulled the handle. The next day, we were both released from the hospital. He made a phone call to the mechanic and asked how the ejection seat worked. Apparently, he was still not convinced that either ejection handle ejects both occupants. He thought he was only ejecting himself. I also learned that he had a conversation with the warbird examiner that evening in the hospital. Mark had told Zach that he indeed initiated the ejection. When Zach asked if he gave the eject, or bail out, he answered no. When the initial NTSB report came out, things began to change drastically in their relationship. And on September 1st, they went to meet to get his stuff out of the hangar. He arrived and he seemed to be very depressed about public opinion of him since the release of the NTSB report. Oh, we didn't have a part in that. I suggested we drink a beer together and talk about it. Sat down in my hangar, drank a beer, discussed the accident again. He repeatedly said he wanted to make a public statement for his mental health. He seemed to be asking permission or blessing each time I said I disagreed with his desire. It's not the right time while the investigation is going on. It just keeps the wound open. I recommended he let time pass and continue to make no comments so people would stop talking about it. There are a lot more news events out there in the world than what happened to those two weeks ago. He asked me if I wanted to talk to his Air Force buddy, Scott Perdue. That seemed like a strange request at the time, seeing that I only met his friend Scott once before, several years ago, and wasn't sure why I would want to speak to him. He's a former military pilot, not a healthcare professional. I have my own military pilot friends to speak to if I wanted to. I said that my mental health was fine, preferred not to talk to anyone. It was at this time I noticed he had placed his phone on my desk face down between us. I just got the sense he was up to something. The time had come to end this meeting, so I told Mark my daughter and I had to leave for a school function, left and closed up the hangar. Within a few hours, the public video with Scott Perdue was out. Haven't heard from Mark since, and we covered that. And I disagreed with that. I didn't think that was a good idea. Regardless of how this played out, I think there's just some stuff, you just got to wait on. So then he talks about his thoughts. And for the fuel control unit, he basically says, first 10 flights were uneventful. Then he had the unacceptable fuel leak from the FCU. We located, used the FCU, appeared to be in great condition. No fuel leaks when installed. We completed checks on it to include full ground runs without afterburner. National Test Pilot School chief test pilot at the time, now president, Jim Brown, flew with him to continue his training. At the time, we can only assume that the replacement FCU was at fault, being that was the only major component we had changed from the last flight, expectation bias. In the following months, my mechanic had located 3 new, never used, zero-time FCUs from Ukraine, purchased all 3 and installed one right away, continued flying with it, no issues. The time between overhauls is 1,000 hours. Apparently, the FCUs are so reliable that the time between overhauls is quite large. Initially, after the airshow incident, I was thinking the FCU may have been the issue, but now I question the possibility of a brand new FCU with only about 12 hours on as the cause of the airshow incident. I firmly believe the incident with Jim Brown III was not a faulty replacement APU, but in fact was a failure of the jet nozzle flap control system. The exact same symptoms on August 13th, and we talked about the test pilot that said he had flown with him and been there before. Below is a picture from the PowerPoint presentation he gave years ago about its recent flight with the MiG-23, discussed the engine incident and the what they had. One of the following pages is a picture from the MiG-23 pilot operating guide, which discusses the failure of the jet nozzle flap control system. Appears that was actually what happened to him. Insufficient thrust with the engine running at non-reheat power. With the engine running at maximum power, the exhaust temperature is 150 degrees below normal. So that's what he thinks is actually what happened. As previously mentioned, the afterburner not lighting during the airshow pass was just an indication of already reduced power state. His opinion about the engine thrust at the time of the accident, he never got to look at the actual RPM gauge, or was a number given to him or referenced by anyone during the incident flight, because he's complaining again that the backseater wasn't helping him out. But he thinks it was about 80% if it's similar to the other event. Again, not enough to maintain an altitude airspeed, but significant output above idle, which is 63 to 66. For comparison, that's the picture from the rear cockpit approaching the Longview, Texas. Periscopes extended. Not a lot of visibility back there. My estimation is at the time of me being ejected from my flying position, I was at about 30 degrees bank, 190 degrees, 190 knots, gear up, half flaps, 80%, 800 to 900, closing in on the field across the highway about half a mile away, which was 2,000 feet from the actual crash site. In my opinion and experience, very doable. I believe it was only a matter of 3 to 5 seconds before engine power was restored, and I would have been able to make the left base entry to land on runway 27. To compare my estimated position at the time of ejection to normal stabilized approach above, I was higher, faster, cleaner, closer to the intent point of landing, and still had more left available once I lined up in correct heading and leveled the wings. The only deficit I had was 10% less RPM. In conclusion, I firmly believe all indicators point to a failure of the jet nozzle flap control system. As I was continuing to fly the aircraft away from the public, I diagnosed the problem, took steps to correct. Mark said, we need to get out of the jet. I said no. As I continued to fly, I was ejected from the aircraft. The cause of the accident was that no pilot was at the controls. This loss of aircraft was potential loss of life as a result of the backseater ejecting us both. And that is his opinion. The interview with the backseater, and there's not much to it. Day of the accident, they noted that would be one of the last acts, 3,000 liters of fuel, 320 to 350 knots. There was a problem. He came out afterburner, brought the throttle back up. There was no change. We need 16 degrees for the wings. Degrees, but it doesn't react. They move their wings to 16 degrees at this point. Altitude is peaking. He began feeling the stall buffet to communicate with the pilot that they needed flaps. The pilot brings in flaps takeoff position, was trading altitude for airspeed, discussed that they could make a runway 27. At this time, they were 3 to 3.5 miles out, and Mark didn't believe they could do it. They had a little discussion about it in front of what's in front of the airplane. Mark gave 5-second warning. We were going to have to get out. The sink rate was increasing. Notice the sink rate was steep, much steeper than a typical 3-degree glide slope. He realized they were approaching out of bounds the ejection seat envelope, which is not 0-0. Back in the stall buffet, Mark called eject, eject, eject. So he says they called it. He pulled the ejection handles and canopies ejected, then the rear seat, then the front seat. A few seconds later, they were in the water. Seat envelope was unsure about what the specs are. Off the top of his head, 3-degree glide slope, must eject before 180 feet AGL. So if you look at the picture of the engine nozzle and the picture just prior to, during, or after the ejection, the nozzles are drooping. Nozzles operate by fuel pressure, and only time nozzles droop is when the engine is shut down or on the ground. With proper operating engine, the nozzles are symmetrical. In the pictures, they are not. Relevant checklist, failure fuel control, automatic fuel control checklist. Recommends safety observer program. Normally, observers not allowed for air shows. Airplane had two tail strikes previously. This statement, after, it's pretty much the same thing about the thrust. We have a problem. Needles remain split, averaging 65%. So not the 80% that he thought the front seat thought he had. Can we make 2-7? Reference to emergency dead stick. Landing on 2-7, backseater looked out the canopy to the left, and the GPS navigator knew that it was not possible due to the current energy state. He said, no, we can't make it. Continue to left turn. Aircraft's now descending a left turn arc and intersects terrain. Will be outside the airport perimeter over 2 miles south of runway 27. Continue left turning. It's modulating the pitch of the aircraft to optimize glide. Any increase in pitch too high, and the wing begins to stall more, and the sink rate increases. A decrease in pitch, and the stall margin gets better, but the sink rate increases even more. Nose aircraft pitch slightly up, trajectory down towards terrain off airport. The rear seat pilot reference having to eject per MiG-23 checklist and manuals. Several seconds went by with no response from the front seat pilot. Descending through 350 feet in a stall buffet, the rear seat pilot activated the ejection seat sequence. Both pilots were ejected safely and no one on the ground was injured. He says the bank angle was approximately 45 degrees and the sink rate was approximately 3,000 feet a minute. So he addresses what we talked about the YouTube video, which is interesting to me. After reading the preliminary report, the backseat pilot recognized inaccuracies and misinformation concerning the accident, the crew, their injuries, and their actions. It became clear that the front seat pilot has a massive financial interest in the accident being someone else's fault. On September 1st, 2023, the aircraft owner invited the backseat pilot to his hangar in East Texas to discuss the accident. Out of an abundance of caution, the backseat pilot recorded the 85-minute conversation. That recording has been provided to the NTSB. The following statements are of note. The owner states, someone forwarded me something stating the NTSB investigator is only supposed to put out the cause of the crash. The ejection was not the cause of the crash. Also of note, the owner speaks of his expectations of the investigation, stating, we were losing altitude. I was managing airspeed. I was trying one more thing. I want to know if I ever got to it. The emergency engine controller. If I got it, doesn't matter. Switch can take up to 20 seconds to function. The owner further states that the ejection was delayed. There's almost a 100% chance that we'd be more broken up, if not dead. Half a second delay would have put me on the ground. Once again, the owner is acknowledging that there was no time left to troubleshoot the engine failure mode, and the ejection envelope has its limits, or was at its limit. The owner further states that whatever troubleshooting he was doing in the front seat was futile and had a slim chance of making any difference for restoring engine thrust. Man, I'm glad we went over it and you asked to check my seat and my harness and all of that stuff, because the way we were flying a couple times, it wasn't. So yeah, half a second would have been very painful, and there was only one slim possibility. Whatever I was doing was going to make it different. With respect to initial reports of crew disagreement or communication breakdown, the owner states that this is not true. Backseat pilot fully agrees with those reports were inaccurate. The fact is, this was professional crew working together to solve an unsolvable problem, working for the best possible outcome. By using CRM training from decades of airline experience, the crew divided duties and utilized the limited time available to attempt an emergency landing. The owner states, I got a link about crew communication broke down. I go, I don't think so. The owner's correct. Crew communication did not break down. Both crew members were calm, cool, and collected through the ordeal. When asked by the backseat pilot, but what were your thoughts? I mean, did you have any thoughts about pulling the handles? The owner, not until you said it. Not until you said it. I didn't have the thought. The owner acknowledges that he was task saturated and unaware of the aircraft's undesired energy state. He was aware that both crew members were exiting the ejection seat envelope. An illustration of the owner's mentality is exhibited when he references airshow performer Randy Ball exiting his parking space next to 23 Uniform Bravo, and some pebbles begin to thrown towards the Uniform Bravo by the other aircraft's jet blast. The owner, wouldn't it be great if we could just pin this on him? Wow. As of September 1, 2023, the owner was still searching for someone else to blame for the engine failure and crash of the MiG-23. At the end of the conversation, before giving the backseat pilot a hug, the owner says, thanks for keeping us alive. The owner acknowledges that under these extreme circumstances, intense pressure of life and death decisions, he was not capable of initiating the ejection sequence in time to save both lives. The safety observer recognized this and acted in the best interest of the crew and the public. Wow. Oh, man. A lot of drama. So NTSB kind of goes, and says that we did the math, and where they ejected, they were almost out of the envelope. And that's true. In ejection seat aircraft, there is a window of ejection. And if you're outside of it, it's not going to be survivable. You want to get out before the sink rate develops. And, the fact that they only got one, barely one swing in the chute, that's pretty evident. Now, the front seat guys, from his perspective, is he was working the problem, had come up with a solution, got it pointed in a direction that he believed was safe, Not sure about his plan to, worst case, to just land it in the field. I don't think that would have been survivable for either of them. But what he was trying to do, and he articulates it later, is get it to that initial not as bad situation, because he is, in his mind, making thrust. That's what he believes, and nothing is telling him otherwise. He's making some thrust, and eventually all he's doing is buying time. Eventually he'll get the engines back online, it'll take off, and then it'll just be a normal landing, and they'll have to pull the seat cushion from their butts. That is also evidence that he was single target track, focused on saving the aircraft, which may or may not be the right answer. So that's tough. It's tough to kind of Monday morning quarterback, because the reality is the backseater ejected them at the last possible moment as things were progressing at that time before they were out of the envelope. Now, it's hypothetical, because we don't know if that engine would have relit or given him more power. We don't know what was going to happen after that to make the aircraft keep going. So I think, the NTSB is going with the actual facts, not the hypothetical facts, which indicate that they were at the edge of the envelope and ejected safely. Would the engine have relit or given them more thrust? Not relit, but given them more thrust if they'd had a couple more seconds? Maybe. Was he in a horrible body position? Yeah, that's a foul, right? He says in one thing that he says eject, eject, eject. He says the other one he didn't. Obviously, the dude wasn't expecting an ejection if he had those injuries and he was looking down and left trying to relight. So, but it's better to have those injuries than just be dead. Now, as for the people on the ground, I mean, yeah, once you're out of the aircraft, it's ballistic. So, we don't know, but definitely some friends lost on this one. And I also agree that, the YouTube interview and all that stuff, Gonki and I talked about this. That wasn't a good plan. I don't agree with that. And especially not with the active investigation going on, recording conversations and all that stuff. I mean, this is, but again, when you feel like you got to protect yourself, I don't know what the laws are in Texas about recording, which parties need to know about recorded conversations. But, it just, two things can be true, right? He could have saved their lives, but also not handle it very well after the fact. The media is going to do what the media is going to do. At the end of the day, the NTSB report is relatively inconclusive. However, it does lean toward the ejection was valid and saved their lives. And they were lucky nothing hit on the ground. But the owners got an argument too, because there's nothing to prove him wrong, right? There's no engine experts to say, yep, it would have or would have not gained more thrust or anything like that. I'm not a MiG-23 expert. This is all just my opinion. So, we don't know. We just have what the NTSB said, and their probable cause was that the engine wasn't producing sufficient power, causing the ejection, which was safe for the two occupants, and they survived. So let me know in the comments what you think. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Thanks for watching. See you next time.